How y'all doing? This review I'm covering another one of the anthologies that Del Rey has produced featuring the stories of Robert E. Howard. Now I've already covered one of his books before in this set, is the Horror Stories of Robert E. Howard. Very good read for those of you who are interested in the old pulps, especially with Robert E. Howard's use of his prose and everything that he's famous for. But of course, Del Rey has also produced other of the books that he's done. The Conan books, which will have all his original short stories that he's done within his lifetime, and also of other characters. You got Bran Mac Morn, you have Kull of Atlantis, and you have Solomon Kane. Gotta have that in your collection, no doubt. But what I'm going to go over through is his historical stories, Sword Woman and Other Historical Adventures. Now, he had a very deep love of history, which you can see that reflected in his writings of his other characters. And here's the thing: the other books that I mentioned and the stories that we're familiar with have a supernatural and fantastic element about it. Like I said, the distant historical-based past, although it's completely fantasy, like Hyborian Age. It can be set in modern times, like Solomon Kane, but it has a lot of horror or fantasy elements in it from time to time. We're familiar with the supernatural part that he's famous for, but what about his just straight historical stories? And that's what this one covers here, because he published several stories in his time, in his short 12 years of writing, from age 18 to his death at 30. And some of these were published, but not all of them. Some of them were fragments and a few bits of poetry. Most of these stories were published in either Oriental stories or the other pulp magazine. What was the other pulp magazine mentioned? Oh, Magic Carpet. But let's explore this. So many of these stories here, most of them take place in the Middle East or around that area of the world, particularly sometime in the Crusades. Not all of them, though, but most of them do. I think a lot of the publishers at the time wanted stories about that time period. But it wasn't strictly to that. Robert E. Howard wrote wherever he could, where he was interested. One of the stories there, like the first one, Spears of Klontarf, which is a simple tale of Irish versus Vikings. You got that classic matchup. And, let's see. But speaking of his more Middle Eastern type stories, there's the Road of Azrael, where, a knight who tries to rescue the woman he loves from a man that's trying to take her as his wife. But what's interesting about that is that the knight I'm mentioning is not the main character. It's not told through his perspective. It's told through a Turk that that accompanies him, and he's told through his eyes. See, here's the thing: you'll find out. You may think Robert E. Howard will be more, he tries to make all his characters Westerners, and all the Middle Easterns and Mongols will be the enemies, but not necessarily so. While most of it will be like that, it's not so much the culture where the man comes from, but the qualities that man has. That's kind of told in the essay at the back of this, I'll mention shortly. Other characters he's wrote, let's see, Red Blades of Cathay, where a guy named Godric de Villehard, Godric of Villehard, he travels to so far into the east, he kind of comes across this one city that, through the illustrations and descriptions there, kind of reads like in China or something like that, and he's this knight who's trying to defend this city against Genghis Khan and his horde. So another one here, speaking of Mongol hordes, another one I've always wanted to read was the Sour of Thunder. And again, this is about a man named Kahal, who is now, again, more further into the west and around the Middle East. Mongol hordes come by, and how he tries to face them. A bit of a tragic ending here. Not all of them survive through this. But let's see. Another one, it's not always serious. I mean, you read a lot of Howard stories. They're usually kind of grim and serious there. Solomon Kane, Bran Mac Morn. You kind of read a sort of sameness about it. But no, there was occasional humorous story. There was at least one humorous story in this that is a Gateshead Vampire. It's about a guy named Giles Hobson, and through his misadventures of getting in trouble, then him trying to get out, only get trouble again, and getting out, and what have you. So he travels across from Europe all the way down to the Middle East and faces, and gets involved in the battles there through his lying and deceiving and what have you. It kind of reminds me of Jack Vance, who did the Dying Earth series, 2 of the books featuring the character Cudgel the Clever, The Eyes Overruled and Cudgel the Clever, where it's the same thing. It's about a man who gets in a bad situation and through his wits gets out of it, and so on and so on. Same idea here. Now, of course, there's Cormac Fitzgeoffrey, who's a half Irish, half Norman savage man here, who's he goes on his series of adventures. He's in 2 stories and in a fragment, and he's also mentioned in another story. I think it was in Sour Thunder. So you got Hawks of Outremur, which they have adapted in comic book form by Boom Comics, which I have all 4 here. This is a 4-issue deal there that is a faithful adaptation to the character of Cormac Fitzgeoffrey. Now, if you read this story and you look at these comics, look at the description there, you might be vaguely familiar. Like another famous Howard character, and almost an attitude and everything. It would be Conan. And you think, well, of course he derived his character after. Well, not quite. You see, that character, the first story, Hawks of Outremur, was published in 1931, and the first Conan story was published in 1932. So at least the publishing, one came, Cormac Fitzgeoffrey was before Conan. I don't know. But you see a lot of the same thing. That's not untypical of Howard. You'll see him writing different characters with almost the same personalities. And usually most people find similarities of Conan, but not always. But, Hawks of Outremur, which is a story of Cormac trying to get revenge on someone who he owes a debt to, and his journey to do that, he ends up helping a man save a woman's love, and ends up face to face with Saladin. This is during the Third Crusade. Other stories involving Cormac would be The Blood of Belshazzar. This is one of those closest to have a supernatural element towards it, but not quite. There's an old gem that the leader of a bandit squad has in this old castle that he claims has the power to keep all these other merciless crew in check. Well, at least he thinks it does. And there's this underground passage that leads to an old ancient temple there that surpasses known history. I say it's the closest to, but without showing any real supernatural elements. Now, the other one, the Spears of Klontarf, also has elements to where it mentions in these like I think the Pictish people, which he puts in his other stories. Yeah, there is a kind of shared universe, in Robert E. Howard, and often his work. Now, there's also a fragment of Slave Princess, which the book has a synopsis that Howard wrote about the events of the story, very short one, and then a partially written form where middle part is missing, or at least part of it. It's not. Oh no, it's not middle part is missing. That's another story, but it wasn't fully complete, but very well done. What was there. Now, of course, when I showed the cover of this book, many of you talk about, what the sword woman part is. That is this character right here. We know the character we're referring to, because if you know Robert E. Howard through comics and what have you, you're familiar with Red Sonja, the sword woman there, chainmail, bikini, and everything. I have the 6 volumes here by, let's see, these were from David C. Smith and Richard L. Tierney, and I got these from my great uncle years ago, who introduced me to the works of Robert E. Howard and all them. Many of you are familiar with maybe that, but most likely through comics. You're sort of the old Marvel comics where he created her for the Conan universe, or through the current Dynamite comics where she's published at. But many of you already know where she's from. The character Red Sonja, as you know her, the sword woman in a chainmail bikini in Hyperborean times, and Conan, was not directly created by Robert Howard. She was a character derived from a few unpublished stories that Howard did. One of them was Shadow of the Vulture, which is where the name Red Sonja comes from. The story itself, Red Sonja is not even the main character. She's a companion character to a guy named Gottfried. The Shadow of the Vulture is about Solomon the Great. He's doing his invasion across Europe. He's doing a major siege in Vienna. And before that, he recognizes a guy who shows up at his court. He's a soldier who's turned drunkard. He's drunk half the time, kind of, down in press for all the events that's happening. He's just devil-may-care attitude about it. But the thing is, Solomon recognized him from a previous battle. He done him a great physical wound, and he wants revenge about it. So he sends one of his viziers to, and sends a guy after him while they're attacking Vienna. Across this Red Sonja, Rogatino is this fierce, devilish woman there. Constantly wants to, fight and what have you. Just as strong as any man. And this is where most sources will tell you where Red Sonja came from, at least in the name as well as the character. But another one, these are from another character which is in reference to the cover right here. It is Dark Agnes. Now, there's about a couple of stories and a fragment in this volume, and I find this one a much more fascinating one. The Red Sonja in Shadow of the Vulture there is just a very vicious woman, not bad, but definitely kind of one note, but interesting. The other one, Dark Agnes, I think is a more rounded character. Dark Agnes, particularly in the story Sword Woman, which is her first story where she began, she's this young woman who lives in a poor village. Her father was a bastard from noble descent, but he is a former mercenary, but he's retired because he can't do it anymore. So he's trying to live at home, but he's very abusive towards her, and he's forcing Agnes to a marriage to someone she doesn't want, and so she takes a dagger and stabs him on the wedding day. She runs off. Come across as a man on the road here who tries to act all nice and noble, even though he doesn't look very rich and all that. He tries to backstab her by selling her to a brothel. And it's her journey to becoming a sword woman right here. So I first came across Dark Agnes through, let's see, these Savage Sword comics, which are these which was done. This was made by Dark Horse at the time. These are these 4 volumes here that I held in my hand. Features Dark Agnes as a character. And let's see, at the beginning of the 3rd story of her is where she first starts off. So where she's forced marriage started adaptation of the first story. The first ones before that are side stories made up to introduce the character, what have you. So that's how I first got introduced to her. And now I got the original stories here, and I find it, Sword Woman is pretty good, where typical Howard fashion takes a woman, she's natural with a blade, she comes across a mercenary who teaches her, and now is trying to send adventures of her towards Italy where she could serve as a mercenary. Never went that far into stories here, but it was a good start. Another story where she features in Blades of France, and there's a fragment, Mistress of Death, and that story there is where there's a beginning part there, middle part's missing, and then the written part. I think the middle part got missing through over time. But there you go. If you want, this would be great to have in your collection here. And when you read these, you might notice maybe not. Okay, obviously not historically accurate. These things will not be. They're meant to be exciting and all that, but feature historical events and characters. Genghis Khan, Saladin, Solomon the Great. Richard Lionheart, and probably others you may not be familiar with. But Howard was very interested in that. And here's the problem with that. Despite his love for the subject, he had very few resources to work with. You'll find that out in an essay written by Howard Andrews Jones, which I'm familiar with him with a couple of his books, Desert of Souls and The Bones of the Old Ones. And he wrote an essay. He was a huge Howard fan, I guess somewhat of a scholar, where he talks about the history of Robert Howard's writing and as far as publishing, his influences, where he had it published to. There's also very few markets at the time when Howard was writing for him to write historical-based stories. I mean, he did Oriental stories, and there was Magic Carpet. There was one that he was deeply influenced, that was published a lot, but he didn't, but most of the stories you write here were never published in his lifetime. Dark Agnes and Sword Woman story was published back in the 70s in a paperback. I only discovered it through the adaptations that they did in the Savage Sword comics. Now, Marvel Comics at the time that this video was made has got to, over the last couple of years, has the rights. They bought it from what Dark Horse had, and now I'm understanding they're now doing their own Dark Agnes stories like that. I like to keep the original myself, what little there was. I like the idea of what could have been out of them, what some people would derive it off to be, especially if it goes in wrong directions. But that's just me. So as you read these stories and you come across things that don't feel right in a typical Howard fashion, one of the things I found out when I was thinking about these is, as I was reading these, I read the essay at the end, and he mentions a lot of what I was thinking of, particularly like in Hawks of Outremer, when you're introduced to Fitzgeoffrey, he's telling his story, how he came to be and where he was at. It's a little bit lengthy there, almost kind of slows things down. I started feeling like that. I understand why, because you need, the entire context to understand the events of the story. But in typical pulp fiction fashion, you want to go, keep going, keep it fast and exciting in most cases. You have thoughts like that as you read the story there, read the essay, and he'll address that, and hey, you feel kind of better about yourself, but I'll let you get into that. So, digressing off a bit here, Sword Woman and Other Historical Adventures, add this to your Robert Howard collection. And I have, just as I showed you, I have all but 3 of the Del Rey produced books here, but I'll have to get those in time. So, yes. But also, I forgot to mention the artwork. Don't want to miss that. John Watkins did the interior artwork. You've seen that at the beginning slideshow I've done. And one of the things I did like about that is it has a wonderful feel that I think is appropriate for the subject of this. Historical-based tales, but you look at the artwork there, and think of old movies like El Cid with Charlton Heston and Sophia Loren, or other such historical films like Captain Blood, which shows up in Robert Howard's time. Also try, so think about, movies in the 20s up until 1960s that are historical based, and more particularly look at the movie posters of said movies, and you get, and I think John Watkins did a wonderful job capturing the feel of that if you imagine if Robert Howard was adapted to movies, this is how you probably would do it, and this is how it probably would have been made. So there you go. That's my thoughts about the interior artwork. It's not Frank Frazetta, and for this case, I don't want it to be. Frank Frazetta did his wonderful takes on a lot of Howard's work, but I think this one right here, John Watkins, captures a great feel that works for his historical-based stories. So yes, Sword Woman, check this out, add it to your collection, enjoy it. Thank you all for watching, and have a nice day.